My name is Evelyn. I'm 63 years old. And my brother, the one my parents gave everything to while leaving me behind, now washes dishes in my restaurant like a man who's run out of places to hide. He moves slowly in the back kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hands raw from hot water and steel wool, shoulders slightly hunched like someone used to looking down, not up. Most people who come into the restaurant don't even know who he is to me. They smile at him when he empties the trash or brings out the mop, thinking he's just some quiet old helper I brought in out of kindness. They don't realize this is the same boy my parents once called brilliant, the one they pushed ahead at every turn, while I learned to shrink myself into the corners of their affection, hoping someday they might glance back and notice I was still there. The restaurant isn't anything fancy. It's small, a little worn in places, and the linoleum floor creaks if you step just right near the pantry. But it's mine. The walls smell like cinnamon and old coffee and roasted vegetables, and the shelves are lined with chipped plates that I rescued from secondhand shops when I couldn't afford better. I painted the signs myself, cooked the first meals on a used stove I fixed with duct tape and prayer, and opened the doors with nothing but a few $100s and a stubbornness I learned from years of being ignored. And somehow, in this simple space with its mismatched chairs and flickering ceiling fan, people found comfort. They came, they stayed, they brought their families, and they returned. It became a place where people felt safe, where the food tasted like something made by hands that had seen too much and given everything anyway. James showed up not long after our mother passed. I hadn't seen him in years. He arrived unannounced, carrying a scuffed suitcase and the kind of look you wear when you've been running from your own reflection for too long. He didn't say much, just stood in the doorway of the kitchen while I was slicing onions and waited. And I didn't say much either. I handed him an apron and pointed toward the sink. He stepped into the back like he belonged there, like decades of silence and distance could be folded up and put away in the same cabinet where we keep the dish towels. From that moment on, he's been there almost every day, not complaining, not talking, just working. I sometimes catch him looking around the restaurant like he's still trying to make sense of where he is and how he ended up here, in a space built by the sister he once laughed at behind closed doors. What no one here sees, what I never talk about, is everything that came before. They don't see the years I spent standing in his shadow, holding my breath, while he took the credit, the attention, the dreams. They don't know how, growing up, he was treated like the sun, the miracle, the one meant to shine, while I was expected to be quiet, useful, invisible. My parents called him gifted before he'd done a thing to earn it. And even when he stumbled, and oh, he stumbled plenty, they still saw him as destined for greatness. I, on the other hand, could get straight A's, cook dinner, clean the house, care for my younger cousins, and it was never enough to be more than a footnote to his story. No one asked what I wanted, what I dreamed about, what made me happy. I was the dependable one, the helper, the quiet girl with calloused hands and unremarkable clothes. And James knew it. He always knew. He could feel the power he held in every room we entered, and he used it like a weapon with a charming smile. He'd steal my notebooks just to ruin my schoolwork, then watch me get in trouble. He made jokes at my expense, whispered things about me to our neighbors' kids, made sure I was always one step behind. He once let me take the blame for something that nearly got me expelled from school, just walked away, like it didn't matter. And the worst part was that my parents never questioned his version of events. They believed him every time. I stopped trying to defend myself because it only made things worse. The more I fought to be heard, the more I was reminded to be silent. After high school, I wanted to go to culinary school, but that conversation never even got off the ground. My parents said there wasn't money for it. And besides, girls like me didn't need fancy degrees. They said I could learn everything I needed right there at home, helping out around the house. Meanwhile, they paid for James's tuition twice after he failed out the first time. He spent those years partying, drifting, never quite finishing anything, but they still looked at him like he was a prince temporarily lost in the woods, sure to find his way eventually. I worked as a waitress, then as a line cook, saving every penny I could in a coffee tin I kept hidden behind the flour. I learned by watching others, asking questions when no one was paying attention, staying late to practice techniques alone. I didn't have teachers or mentors, just hunger, not for food, but for a place in the world that belonged only to me. When our father passed, It was me who arranged the funeral. I signed the paperwork, cleaned the house, cooked the meals for guests, and held my mother's hand while she cried. James came late and left early, and still somehow ended up being the one everyone thanked. After that, I stayed close to home, partly out of duty, partly because I had nowhere else to go. Then, when our mother got sick, I became her full-time caregiver. I fed her, bathed her, monitored her medications, and slept on the floor beside her bed for over a year. James sent a few texts during that time, maybe a card or two. He didn't visit, not until the very end, and even then, he acted like he had been by her side all along. I watched him charm the hospice nurse and entertain old family friends, and all I could think was how easily people forgave him, how quickly they forgot what absence looks like when it wears a nice shirt and speaks with a soft voice. After she died, I thought maybe, just maybe, there would be some recognition of everything I had done. But then, the letter arrived, a thick envelope from a law office, stamped and sealed. I knew before I opened it, I knew what it would say. She had left everything to James. The house, the land, the savings, the family photos, the heirloom dishes, every last thing. There wasn't a word about me. Not a trinket, not a note, not even the old quilt I had made for her with my own hands when she first got sick. It was like I had never existed. I sat on the back steps of my restaurant for a long time after reading that letter. The evening was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath, and the only sound came from the clatter of pans as James worked in the kitchen unaware. He doesn't know I've seen the will. He doesn't know that once again, our mother chose him, but I know. And for the first time, knowing doesn't hurt the way it used to. It doesn't break me. It fuels me. Because now, I don't need anything from them. Not their permission, not their love, not their name on a piece of paper. I have this place, this life, this strength that no one gave me but me. They may have given everything to him, but I built everything for myself. They left me behind, yes, but I was never broken, and I never will be. When I try to remember my childhood, I find myself sifting through memories, like someone sorting through an attic full of boxes that were never labeled. Some are soft and quiet, like the rustling of leaves outside my bedroom window, or the way the air smelled right before rain, but most are heavy, sharp-edged, and too familiar. I remember how the floorboards creaked in the hallway outside my room, how the light from the kitchen always seemed to stop just short of my door, how I used to hold my breath whenever I heard my brother's footsteps coming up behind me, because I never knew what he'd take from me next. My peace, my notebook, my place at the table. What stayed with me most wasn't what was said, but what was done and undone. The countless ways I was made to feel like an afterthought in my own home. James had a way of taking up space that pushed everyone else aside, and our parents didn't just let him, they encouraged it. From the time we were children, it was as if he had a spotlight stitched into his skin, and the rest of us were expected to applaud from the shadows. He didn't have to try to be special. It was simply assumed he was. His smile could turn a mistake into a joke. His silence could pass for deep thought, and his tantrums were treated like evidence of a strong will. Meanwhile, if I cried, I was called dramatic. If I spoke up, I was scolded. If I succeeded at something, it was ignored, or worse, treated like a threat to his image. I spent years trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided what I was worth, and it was never more than what was convenient for them. There were so many small moments that marked me in ways I didn't fully understand back then. I remember how James would hide my school books just to watch me panic before the bus came. He once broke a vase and left the pieces on my bed, knowing I'd be blamed, and I was. There was a time when he told the neighbor kids I wasn't really his sister, that I was adopted, that I had been left on the porch in a basket, and when I tried to defend myself, the adults chuckled like it was all some harmless story. But I felt the sting of it in my chest, the way you feel shame when you know no one will step in for you. And the more he got away with it, the more he did it. He learned early that he could bend the truth and walk away while I was left to carry the weight of it. Our mother always defended him, no matter what. She saw his cruelty as charm, his laziness as brilliance waiting to bloom. If he forgot to do his chores, she did them for him. If he failed a test, she blamed the teacher. I once overheard her telling a friend that he was going to be someone important one day, and that she would do anything to help him get there. I never heard her say anything like that about me. My name wasn't mentioned when it came to plans or dreams. It was only brought up when something needed doing. I was expected to be the good daughter, the steady one, the quiet helper who kept the household running while they poured their resources, time, and affection into a boy who never saw anyone but himself. As I got older, the gap between us only widened. While he was being driven to music lessons and youth clubs, I was home peeling potatoes and folding laundry. He had new shoes for every school year. I wore mine until the soles wore thin. When he needed money for a class trip, it appeared without question. When I asked for a part-time job to save up for cooking school, I was told there wasn't time for that my place was at home. I learned to stop asking. I stopped bringing home the certificates I won at school, stopped sharing my drawings and poems, stopped speaking unless spoken to. It was easier to go unnoticed than to be reminded, yet again, that I didn't measure up. Not to him, not to the expectations they had built around his name. The worst part wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the coldness that grew in our house whenever I dared to want something more. There was a particular winter, cold and gray, the kind that sank into your skin no matter how many sweaters you wore, when I had secretly applied for a scholarship to attend a local culinary program. I hadn't told anyone, not even my closest friend at the time. I just filled out the forms and mailed them myself, hoping that maybe if I was accepted, they'd finally see me. A few weeks later, the acceptance letter came in a plain white envelope, and I remember holding it in my hands like it was the only proof I existed outside their narrow view of me. But James found it before I could hide it, and by the time my parents knew about it, they had already decided that I wouldn't be going. The money was being saved for his second round of college after he dropped out the first time. They said there would be other chances for me, but deep down, I knew that was a lie they told to keep me quiet, not a promise they intended to keep. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and ripped that letter into tiny pieces, not out of rage, but because it hurt less to destroy it myself than to watch someone else do it. I remember folding the scraps into an old envelope and stuffing it into the back of my closet, where I wouldn't have to see them again. In that moment, something inside me hardened. Not bitterness, not yet, but something close, a kind of resolve. I told myself that if no one was going to open doors for me, I'd start learning how to build my own. In the years that followed, I learned to cook by watching others from the sidelines. I paid attention to the small things, how a sauce changed when the heat was lowered, how a knife should glide rather than press, how good food wasn't just about taste, but about memory and love and presence. I worked in kitchens where no one bothered to remember my name, took on shifts no one else wanted, scrubbed floors after hours just for the chance to ask one more question or watch one more dish come together. I didn't have anyone cheering me on, no one waiting at home with words of encouragement, but I kept going because there was something inside me that refused to be erased, no matter how many times others tried. Looking back, I think it was during those quiet, difficult years, when I was working double shifts, saving every spare dollar, sleeping 5 hours a night, that I first began to understand what real strength looked like. Not the kind people praise with fanfare and applause, but the kind that grows in silence, beneath the surface, steady and unseen. I had no safety net, no support, no one telling me I could do it, but I did it anyway. James, meanwhile, drifted from one failed opportunity to the next, always landing on his feet because someone else made sure he did. He never had to clean up his own mess. When he dropped out of his second school, our parents told everyone he had decided to take a gap year to find himself. When he couldn't hold a job, they said the companies didn't recognize his potential. There was always an excuse, always a cushion waiting for him, and through it all, I watched quietly, reminding myself that I didn't need the same kind of help to move forward. I just needed the will to keep going. Now, years later, I stand in the kitchen of the restaurant I built from nothing, watching my brother wipe down counters under flickering lights, and I think back to the girl who used to cry herself to sleep in a twin bed with a broken spring and a heart full of questions. I wish I could go back and tell her what I know now, that she wasn't invisible, that her dreams weren't foolish, that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy, that in the end, the people who made her feel small would one day need to look up just to meet her eyes. By the time I was in my early 20s, I had learned how to survive quietly. I worked long hours, took whatever jobs came my way, and lived in a small apartment over a laundromat that smelled like steam and fabric softener, no matter how many candles I lit. I didn't expect much from life by then. I didn't think in terms of happiness or success or love. I thought in terms of getting through the day without falling apart. I was good at pretending everything was fine, smiling at customers, folding napkins into neat triangles, cleaning up other people's messes, both at work and at home. I had learned how to keep my head down, how to blend in, how to make myself useful without being seen. That's what I thought my life would always be. And then, for a little while, it wasn't. It started quietly. Like most good things do. There was a man, Thomas, who worked as a driver for one of the produce suppliers that delivered to the diner where I waited tables. He had kind eyes and an easy laugh, and he noticed me in a way that felt different. Not because I was doing something for him, not because he needed anything, just because I was there. He started arriving early for deliveries and staying a few minutes after, leaning against the wall while I filled salt shakers or wiped down menus. We never talked about anything important, mostly small things, food, weather, a joke about how I folded napkins better than anyone he'd ever met. But something about the way he looked at me made me feel like I was finally being seen, not as a tool or a task, but as a person with a whole world inside her. I kept my guard up at first, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because I didn't know how to let it down. When someone spends most of their life being ignored or used, it becomes hard to believe kindness can come without a cost. But he kept showing up, day after day, week after week. One night, after the diner closed, we sat on the back steps drinking bad coffee out of paper cups. And I remember thinking that if I ever got to choose who I was in someone's eyes, I'd want to be who I was in his. We started seeing each other more, walking together after shifts, talking about our dreams in a way that didn't feel foolish or childish. For the first time, I let myself imagine a life that wasn't just about surviving, one where I might actually be happy. We began making plans, nothing grand, just ours. He said he'd help me open my own place, something small and honest where I could cook what I wanted and serve people who cared. We sketched out menus on napkins, made lists of equipment we'd need, even found a tiny storefront for rent 2 blocks from the train station. I had saved enough for the deposit, and he said he'd handle the paperwork. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment everything changes. This is the turn in the road I'd been waiting for my whole life. But the road didn't turn. It disappeared. One morning, 2 days before we were supposed to sign the lease, he stopped answering my calls. At first, I thought maybe something had happened. An accident, an emergency, something outside his control. I called his phone. I called the produce company. I even walked to his apartment and stood outside for an hour, hoping he'd show up. But he never did. It was as if he had vanished. No note, no explanation, just silence. And with that silence came a slow, creeping shame that wrapped itself around me like smoke. Because deep down, part of me had expected it. Days turned into weeks, and I kept working, kept pretending, kept folding napkins with hands that shook more than they used to. And then one night, when I came home from a double shift and checked the mailbox, there was a letter with no return address. Inside was a short message, typed on plain white paper, telling me he had left town, that he wasn't ready, that it wasn't about me. But it was about me, because a few months later, during a family dinner where my mother was already on her second glass of wine, she let something slip she didn't mean to. She thought I knew. She thought someone had told me. She didn't realize I had never heard the truth. She had paid him to leave. She had sat him down in our kitchen and told him I was fragile, unwell, unfit for the kind of life he wanted. She had offered him enough money to clear his debts, move to another city, and forget I ever existed, and he had taken it, just like that. He hadn't even fought for me. He hadn't asked for my side of the story. He had looked at my mother, the woman who had spent her life ignoring mine, and believed every word. And with that belief, he erased me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment, surrounded by crumpled napkins with half-finished menus, and I cried for the girl who thought she could build something with someone who saw her. I cried for the time I had lost, the future that had been dangled in front of me only to be ripped away, and for the ache of being betrayed not just by him, but by my own mother. Again. But somewhere between the sobs and the silence, something in me hardened for good. Not in a way that made me cruel or bitter on the outside, but in a way that made me stop waiting for someone to rescue me, stop hoping someone would come along and make things right. I realized that no one was coming, and that if I wanted to change my life, I'd have to do it with my own 2 hands. So I got up the next morning, wiped my face, went to work, and kept saving. Every dollar, every tip, every little bonus. I didn't talk about dreams anymore. I just did the work. I learned more, watched more, practiced alone at night in the diner's back kitchen when the manager was too tired to care. I burned things, ruined sauces, made terrible bread, and then I learned how to fix it. I didn't have anyone cheering me on or giving me second chances, but I didn't need them, because after all the bitterness, all the disappointment, all the people who had left me behind, I still had one thing no one could take away. I knew how to endure. And sometimes endurance is the first step toward becoming someone no one sees coming. I had almost stopped thinking about dreams by the time my father passed. Life had folded itself into a series of tired habits: early mornings, late nights, tight budgets, cracked heels, and aching hands. He had been sick for a long time, and while James kept his distance, offering vague apologies from other cities and occasional short visits that felt more like performances than concern, I was the one who stayed. I made the doctor's appointments, kept the fridge stocked with soft foods, washed the stained sheets when the sickness got worse, and sat beside him in silence when he no longer had the strength to speak. He was a quiet man at the end, more shadow than person, shrinking with each passing week, like someone slowly fading out of the frame of his own life. And still, I hoped, maybe foolishly, that before he was gone, he might see me. But he never said the words I needed to hear. There were no apologies, no revelations, no last-minute blessings passed down in whispers, just long silences, shallow breathing, and the sound of the wind outside the bedroom window. And when it was over, there wasn't a funeral full of grand stories. There were casseroles dropped off by neighbors, a short service, a cheap casket, and James standing at the pulpit, painting a picture of a man I didn't recognize and a family that had never really existed. I stayed in the back pew, hands folded in my lap, watching my brother cry for a version of our father he had barely known in the end, and wondering if grief was supposed to feel more like sadness and less like exhaustion. After the funeral, while my mother retreated further into herself, and James returned to whatever life he was piecing together out of charm and avoidance, I stayed behind to clean out the house. It was an old place, sagging in the corners and creaking with secrets, full of dusty drawers and forgotten corners. I moved room to room slowly, sorting through years of clutter, unsure what was trash and what was meant to be saved. And then, tucked in the back of my father's dresser beneath a pile of old receipts and yellowed newspaper clippings, I found a thin envelope with my name written across the front in his uneven handwriting. It was the only thing in the whole house addressed to me. I held that envelope for a long time before opening it, sitting on the edge of their bed, surrounded by the stale smell of sickness and lavender. Inside was a single folded page. No greeting, no closing, just a few short paragraphs written in the kind of honest, hesitant tone that only appears when it's too late to say something out loud. He wrote about how he had seen more than I thought he had, how he had noticed the way I carried the weight no one else acknowledged, how he wished he had been stronger, braver, more fair. He admitted he had failed me, and he knew it. But what caught me off guard was what came next. Folded inside the note was an old recipe card, brittle and stained, in his handwriting. It was for a dish I hadn't seen in years, a savory pie he used to make only once a year, the kind of meal people remembered long after they left the table. It had been his favorite to cook, but he'd stopped making it when James became the center of attention, saying there was no time, that other things were more important. Now, it was in my hands, as if he was passing something on, not wealth, not property, not a legacy in the way people normally mean it, but something simpler, something sacred, his trust. I don't know how long I sat there staring at that card, but something shifted in me that day. Not like a light bulb switching on, but more like a slow, deep cracking of something buried under years of resentment and silence. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe I wasn't wrong for wanting more. Maybe I hadn't imagined everything. Maybe someone had seen me after all, even if it came too late to change the past. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had begun inside me. Quietly, but steadily, I started experimenting with that recipe in my tiny kitchen at home, testing and retesting until I got it just right. The first few tries were clumsy, but with every attempt, I could feel my father's presence beside me, not as the man who had ignored me, but as the one who had finally tried to reach me through something we both understood: food. Cooking became something different after that. It wasn't just work or escape, it was memory. It was a form of claiming space in a world that had always tried to shrink me down to nothing. Not long after, I heard that the old corner bakery on Main Street had closed. The windows were boarded up, and a faded "For Lease" sign hung crooked in the front. It was small, narrow, nothing special to most people, but to me, it looked like possibility. I passed by it for days without stopping, afraid of what wanting it might cost me. But one evening, as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops and the wind carried the smell of something warm from a nearby cafe, I stopped walking and went inside. The landlord met me with keys and a tired voice, and somehow I walked out of there with a signed agreement and the terrifying knowledge that I had just made a commitment to something that might finally be mine. Opening the restaurant was nothing like the glossy stories you read in magazines. It was brutal. I cleaned the floors myself, painted the walls with a brush so old the bristles came off in streaks, and bought supplies from flea markets and clearance bins. I worked 16-hour days, burned through every cent I had, cried into mixing bowls at 2 in the morning, and doubted myself more times than I could count. But I didn't quit, because every time I looked at that recipe card taped above the stove, I remembered why I started. Not to prove anything to them, not to fix what had been broken, but to build something no one could take away from me ever again. And then, just as I was preparing to open the doors, just as the tables were set, and the first batch of dough was rising in the oven, James came back. I hadn't heard from him in months. He looked older, thinner, lost in a way that didn't suit the golden boy persona he had carried for most of his life. He stood in the doorway like someone searching for an answer, like someone who had finally run out of people to charm. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for help. He just said he needed work. And I looked around at the space I had built, the cracked countertop, the thrifted chairs, the smell of garlic and flour and fresh hope, and told him he could start with the dishes. Not out of kindness, not out of revenge, just because I needed someone to wash the pans. And now, here we are, me at the front, taking orders, greeting customers, managing the chaos, him in the back, scrubbing and rinsing, silent and slow. I haven't told him about the letter. I haven't told him about the recipe, the card, or the words our father left behind. But every time I roll out that dough and shape the crust just the way he did, I feel stronger. Not because of what was given to me, but because of what I finally took for myself. The first time someone came into the restaurant and asked if I was related to James, the man opening a new place across town, I felt something shift in my stomach, something that wasn't quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. I smiled, nodded politely, said we were family, then excused myself to the kitchen before the blood in my face could betray me. I stood in the walk-in fridge, pretending to organize produce, until the tightness in my chest eased. It was happening, just like I had feared, just like I should have expected. He hadn't just opened a new place, he had opened a mirror, a replica, a shadow of everything I had built, and he had put his name on it like it had always belonged to him. The whispers grew louder every day. Customers came in curious, some out of loyalty, others to compare. A few even said it out loud, wondering if we were partners, if we had gone into business together, if the new place was meant to be an expansion. And I said nothing, not because I didn't have the words, but because I knew no matter what I said, there would always be people who believed him. People had always believed him. That was his gift. He could smile and speak softly and make you forget the sharpness hiding behind his teeth. He could fail with style and still be admired for the effort, while I had spent my entire life proving myself twice over, just to be taken seriously once. Then came the betrayal I hadn't expected. A woman I'd known for years, A regular who had once cried at my table after her husband left her, who had hugged me after every meal and said I reminded her of her sister, walked in, looked me in the eye, and told me she'd tried his version of the pie. She said it was good. She said it was close. She said maybe I should talk to him, combine forces, let the past go. I nodded. I smiled, but I felt something inside me wither a little. Not from anger, from realization that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how deeply I rooted myself in the truth, someone could always come along, steal the fruit, and serve it on a prettier plate. I tried to keep my focus, to stay grounded in what I had built. My place was still full most days, still filled with warmth and gratitude and the kind of quiet pride that doesn't need to announce itself. But there was a heaviness now, a background hum of comparison I couldn't quite shake. I found myself checking his reviews late at night, scrolling through photos of his clean white walls and polished dishes, reading comments from strangers who called him a rising star. They didn't know he had once mocked me for wanting to own a stove. They didn't know he had never washed a dish until the day I handed him an apron. They didn't know the recipe wasn't his. And then one night, after a particularly long shift, I came home to find a flyer tucked into my door, a glossy, full-color ad for James's table, offering a limited-time tasting menu featuring his signature heirloom family pie. My father's recipe, my hands, my history, packaged and priced at $25 a plate with a wine pairing and a story he didn't earn. I sat on the steps, staring at that paper, and for the first time in years, I felt the old fire return. Not the steady flame I had nurtured through grief and labor, but the sharp, wild heat that comes from watching someone take what they never respected in the first place. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the flyer in half, drive across town, walk into his kitchen, and demand that he explain how it felt to wear my skin while pretending it was his. But instead, I went inside, tied on my apron, and baked. Not just one pie, 5. I made each crust by hand, pressed the dough slowly, chilled it just right, braised the filling until it melted like memory on the tongue, and seasoned it with everything I had ever felt. Loss, fury, silence, pride. I didn't serve them that night. I just baked and stood in the kitchen, breathing in the scent of what was mine. The next morning, I donated them to the church food bank down the street. Let someone else taste something honest. Let someone else carry away a piece of me, because I knew something James didn't. You don't protect a legacy by fighting over it. You protect it by living it so fully, so deeply, that no one else can wear it without it falling off like a bad disguise. But that didn't stop him from trying. Over the next few weeks, I heard stories about staff leaving his place after 2 paychecks bounced, about recipes that changed daily because he couldn't keep ingredients stocked, about customers who said the pie tasted different every time they came in. I heard about arguments in the kitchen, delays in orders, and his growing frustration when people asked if he was the one who used to work at my place. He hated that, hated being tied to me in any way he couldn't control. And yet, he had tethered himself to my work so completely, he couldn't stand without it. Then came the night he showed up at my restaurant after closing. He didn't say anything, just stood outside in the alley behind the kitchen, smoking, eyes dark with something I hadn't seen in years. Defeat. I watched him from the other side of the window for a long time, wondering if he would come in, if he would apologize, if he would say anything at all. But he didn't. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his heel, and walked away. I never asked where he went after that, but I knew. The place closed a month later. The sign came down. The windows were covered in brown paper. And just like that, the golden boy's dream dissolved into silence. Again. But this time, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt sadness, not for him, but for the part of me that had once believed he might finally change. It didn't take long for the silence to crack. For weeks after James's restaurant folded, there was nothing but absence. No word, no message, not even a whispered apology left behind, like dust in the corners of what he had tried to build. People stopped asking about him, the flyers disappeared, and his name slowly lost its shine in the mouths of those who once repeated it like it meant something. But I knew it wasn't over. Not really, because men like James don't vanish quietly. They drift until the world no longer bends for them. And then they come back, tired, bitter, and ready to blame whoever is still standing. The first time I saw him again, it was late on a Wednesday. I was closing alone, wiping down tables while the last batch of bread cooled on the rack, when I heard the soft knock at the back door. I didn't flinch. I didn't need to look to know it was him. The kind of presence he carried was still heavy, even when his pride had thinned. I opened the door slowly, and there he stood, shoulders sunken, coat wrinkled, eyes hollow like someone who had run out of stories to sell. He didn't ask to come in. He just stared at me, waiting for something. Pity, maybe, or permission, or proof that I still had enough of the old Evelyn left in me to make room for his regret. I didn't say a word. I stepped aside and let him walk into the kitchen like he had done it 1,000 times before. He sat at the prep table, and for a long while, the only sound in the room was the quiet click of the cooling oven and the slow, deliberate way I continued to clean. Eventually, he spoke. He didn't explain or admit or reflect. He blamed. He said things hadn't gone his way, that investors backed out, that staff were unreliable, that customers had unrealistic expectations. He said he'd tried to honor the family, to carry on something meaningful, and that people hadn't appreciated it. And then, slowly, he turned his eyes to me. Not angry, not quite, but resentful. The way someone looks when they've convinced themselves that their failure is someone else's fault. He said that I had ruined his chances, that I had turned people against him, that I had made it impossible for him to succeed under the weight of my story. And I listened. I stood across the room, wiping down a cutting board, steadying my breath, and I let him say everything he needed to say because I wasn't afraid of his words anymore. I had already lived through worse. He couldn't break something I had built brick by brick from the silence he left me in. What hurt me once didn't hurt the same way now. It passed over me like wind through an open window, present but powerless. I watched him shrink in front of me, not physically, but in spirit. The man who once carried every room, who used to walk with his chin high and his smile sharp, now looked like a boy who had run out of excuses and found no one left to believe in them. For a moment, I thought about all the ways I could have responded. I could have shouted, told him everything he'd taken, reminded him of the late nights and burned savings and stolen recipes and how many times he had left me to pick up pieces he'd shattered for fun. But I didn't, because none of that would change who he was or who I had become. Instead, I handed him a slice of pie, not a gesture of forgiveness, not a peace offering, just a simple, quiet reminder of what he had tried to copy but never understood. He took it, slowly, like he wasn't sure if it was kindness or condemnation, and I watched him eat it with the same expression I'd seen on 100 customers' faces: nostalgia, warmth, and something just out of reach. When he finished, he placed the empty plate beside him and looked down at his hands as if hoping they might say something he couldn't. I told him he could come in a few hours a week to wash dishes if he needed the money. I didn't offer more. I didn't promise anything. I just gave him the one thing he never gave me: space to choose who he wanted to be next. And when he nodded, it wasn't with pride or gratitude, but with the quiet acceptance of a man who finally understood that his name alone wasn't enough to carry him. After that night, he came and went like any other employee. No special treatment, no second chances beyond the ones I gave every single person who walked through my kitchen doors. He scrubbed pots, took out the trash, and avoided eye contact on the days the restaurant was full of people complimenting the food. He said very little, and I didn't ask for more. We coexisted, not as siblings, not as enemies, but as two people who had finally run out of old roles to perform. Some nights, after close, I caught him looking at the framed recipe card still taped above my prep station, the one I had rewritten by hand after he tried to take the original. And I could see it in his eyes, the understanding that no matter how many steps he memorized or how closely he mimicked the crust, the thing he had always been missing wasn't a secret spice or a perfect technique. It was the years I had carried it alone, the bruises, the nights I went without, the pride I had to swallow, the love I never got but still tried to give. That was the part he could never recreate, because you can't steal pain and turn it into flavor unless you've lived it yourself. And I had lived it, every minute, every breath. I had almost made peace with the silence between us when the phone call came. It was short, matter of fact, the kind of call that leaves your hands shaking even though your voice stays steady. Our mother was sick. sicker than anyone realized, and she didn't have much time. The woman on the other end said she'd been moved into a care facility just outside of town, that she had asked for me by name, and that if I wanted to see her, I shouldn't wait too long. I stood there for a long time after the line went dead, staring at the floor like it held the answer to a question I had never dared ask. Did I owe her anything? Did time erase everything she refused to say? For a few days, I did nothing. I went to work, stirred sauces, kneaded dough, smiled at customers, and kept my face composed, even when my chest felt hollow. I didn't mention it to James, though I had a feeling he already knew. He had grown quieter since the restaurant folded, smaller somehow, like someone trying not to take up space in a room where he once stood too tall. But there were glances, those careful sideways looks when I opened mail, or paused near the phone, or wiped down the prep table longer than needed. He was waiting for me to make the first move. Maybe he knew that if I didn't, he couldn't. Eventually, I went. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, just out of something deeper than either, something that looked a little like closure and a little like curiosity. The care home was quiet, filled with soft footsteps and the hum of distant televisions, the scent of antiseptic and boiled vegetables lingering in the air like a memory no one wanted to keep. I found her in a small room at the end of the hall, sitting in a reclining chair beside the window, her frame swallowed by a pale blue blanket, her hands fragile and spotted like leaves left too long in the sun. She looked older than I remembered, not just in body, but in presence. She didn't hold herself like someone in charge anymore. She looked like someone waiting for permission to fade. She turned when she heard me enter, and for a moment, there was something in her eyes that caught me off guard. Not regret, not apology, but recognition. Like she finally saw me, not as the child she once dismissed, but as the woman I had become in spite of her. I didn't sit right away. I stood across from her, watching her watch me, letting the weight of all those years fill the room until it was almost hard to breathe. When I did finally take the chair beside her, she reached for my hand. I let her. Her grip was weak, barely there, but it was the first time in my life I had felt her reach for me without wanting something in return. She didn't speak much. Her voice was thin, brittle, a thread unraveling at the edges. She asked about the restaurant, about the food, about James. Her questions came slowly, spaced between long pauses, and I answered them quietly, without anger, without bitterness. I told her the truth. Not every detail, not every scar, but enough for her to know that I had made something real out of everything she had once overlooked. At one point, she closed her eyes and whispered something about the past, about choices she had made, and how she thought she was doing what was best for the family. There was no confession, no drama, just a tired woman trying to put words around a lifetime of silence. And somehow, I didn't need more than that. I visited her a few more times in the weeks that followed, each time feeling less like the daughter she had once forgotten, and more like a person who had finally stopped needing her to see me clearly. James came with me once. He brought flowers. He sat beside her with the awkward stillness of a man who had run out of roles to play. He didn't say much. Neither did she. But when we left, he looked at me in the parking lot with an expression I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was thanks. Whatever it was, it didn't need to be spoken. Not long after, she passed. The care home called early in the morning. It was quiet, they said, peaceful. They asked if we'd like to collect her things. James offered to handle the arrangements, and I let him. I didn't need another funeral to remember what had been lost. I had already grieved that version of my mother a long time ago. But there was one thing I knew I had to do. The night before the memorial, I stayed late at the restaurant and baked the savory pie. The one from my father's recipe. The one she used to refuse to eat because it reminded her of arguments she never wanted to relive. I made it just as he had taught me, with care, with patience, with quiet precision, and I brought it to the small gathering James arranged at her old house. Most of the guests were distant relatives, neighbors, a few old friends who remembered her as someone she may or may not have truly been. When I placed the pie on the table, someone smiled and said it smelled like childhood, like a Sunday dinner they hadn't tasted in decades. They took slices, one after another, until it was gone. James didn't say much that day. He stood off to the side, watching everyone eat, his expression unreadable. But when he caught my eye from across the room, I saw it. underneath the tiredness, beneath the regret, there was something else. Respect, maybe, or understanding, or the quiet knowledge that this time he couldn't take the credit. This time, everyone knew where the love had come from. That night, when I closed up the restaurant and turned off the lights, I stood alone in the kitchen and thought about the word forgiveness, not as something that had to be given like a gift, but as something that could be felt like a release. I hadn't said it out loud, not to her, not to James, not even to myself. But I had let go of something I had carried for far too long. And in that space, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. It's strange how quietly justice settles into your life when you stop begging the world to deliver it and instead build it slowly, patiently, with your own two hands. Because now, after everything, after the years of being forgotten, after watching my brother fall forward into every opportunity that was once denied to me, after caring for the parents who never once asked what I had sacrificed, I find myself waking up each morning, not with bitterness, not even with pride, but with something quieter and stronger, something that feels like peace rooted deep beneath my ribs, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen or praised, but simply grows, quietly and firmly, no longer needing permission to exist. The restaurant is thriving, not in the glamorous magazine cover kind of way, but in the way that matters most. Full tables, warm food, returning faces, and a space that feels honest, safe, and earned. And every corner of it, from the flour-dusted prep counters to the hand-sewn curtains to the recipe card I still keep taped above the stove, is built on something real, something lived, something no one else could ever claim as their own, because they didn't suffer through the silence that shaped it. James still works here sometimes, though the shine that once made people bend toward him like he was the sun has faded into something dull and distant. And while he doesn't talk much about the restaurant he lost, or the things he tried to take from me, or the way his name no longer opens doors the way it once did, I can see it in the way he moves, slower now, more careful, more aware of the space he takes up and the space he no longer controls. And although we speak little, there's a quiet understanding between us, not of reconciliation, but of distance accepted and boundaries restored. And that's more than I ever expected. He gets paid for the hours he works, and I don't offer more than that, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer owe anyone explanations or chances or softness they never earned. My mother is gone now, and though her absence doesn't echo the way I once imagined it might, there are days when I feel the weight of everything we never said, of everything she withheld, and yet even that grief has softened, not forgiven, not rewritten, but set down like a heavy bowl finally placed on the table after being carried too long. And in that space, I found the kind of release I didn't think possible. She made her choices. I survived them. That's enough. The pie, my father's pie, my pie now, remains the centerpiece of the menu, the thing that brings people back, not just for its taste, but for how it makes them feel. And every time someone closes their eyes after that first bite, or lets out that soft sound of recognition that says they've remembered something important from their own past, I know I've done something good. Not flashy, not grand, but true. And that truth, that quiet, layered, deeply earned truth, is more powerful than any spotlight, any inheritance, any last name ever could be. There was a day not long ago when a young woman came into the restaurant and asked if I had always dreamed of this, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer, because the truth is, I hadn't dreamed of this exactly. I had just dreamed of being seen, of mattering, of not having to shrink myself in order to survive in someone else's shadow. And what I built wasn't the dream, it was the answer to the life I was given, and maybe that's even more meaningful. She smiled when I told her that, and I could see something shift behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or hope. And in that moment, I realized how far I had come, how far I had risen from the silence that once tried to define me. So now, as I close the restaurant each night, wiping down the counter where 1,000 meals have been served with love and sweat and years of effort no one ever saw, I take one last look around the room and feel not loss, not anger, but something still and whole. I didn't win because I beat someone else. I won because I didn't quit when the world told me I should. I didn't give up when I was told to stay small. I didn't bend to bitterness when betrayal found me again and again. I kept going. I stayed true. I chose myself. And now, I want to ask you something, not as someone who stood above it all, but as someone who has been bruised and worn and left behind more times than I can count. Have you ever been the one they overlooked? The one who gave and gave while someone else took the credit, the comfort, the future that should have been shared? Have you ever been told to wait your turn only to watch that turn pass you by year after year until you forgot what you were even waiting for? Because if you have, then maybe you understand what it means to build a life from broken pieces, to knead your sorrow into something people taste and call beautiful without knowing the pain it came from. And if you do, then I want to hear from you. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? What did you do in yours? Because sometimes the people who were left behind are the ones who build the places others come home to. And sometimes the best revenge is being truly, deeply, gloriously whole.